World powers and Iran have reached an historic nuclear deal, ending a decade-long deadlock over Tehran's nuclear ambitions. The breakthrough came on the fifth day of intense talks after the foreign ministers from all six negotiating world powers and Iran narrowed down the remaining obstacles in Geneva. We'll get now across live to our correspondent Polly Boyka, who's there for us. So, Polly, details of the long-awaited deal are emerging right now. So what do we know so far?
Well, what a momentous occasion, first of all, after two sets of failed negotiations before this, 10 years of political wrangling over Iran's nuclear issue, 5 days of talks, intense, heated talks here in Geneva, a night of several hundred journalists sleeping in the media center waiting for a decision, and we finally have a breakthrough. That historical deal has been reached. Now, it's hard to describe just how tense the atmosphere has been here throughout the night, waiting for any sort of news from those negotiations to find out whether or not that deal has been made. And up until the very last moment, when we received the news about the deal being made, there was no way of knowing which way it was going to go, because sticking points still remained between all the sides. Now, the agreement that we have at the moment, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, coincides with what Russia had been proposing from the offset in these nuclear negotiations. Now, what are the details that we know so far? Well, Foreign Minister, according to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the agreement recognizes Iran's right to a peaceful nuclear program, but it would be under the strict condition of inspections from the IAEA. I think we can have a listen to Sergei Lavrov talking about that right now.
The agreement is based on the concept put forward by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The six negotiating powers agreed to recognize Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy, including its right to nuclear enrichment, on the condition that its program is placed under strict control by the IAEA. This will boost confidence and will let our EU and US partners ease sanctions against Iran that they introduced bypassing the UN Security Council. Russia has never recognized the unilateral penalties. Easing pressure on Iran should start with lifting those.
Now, among the details that weren't mentioned there by Sergei Lavrov is that there will be the 6-month freeze of Iran's nuclear program. No new centrifuges are going to be added, and no new uranium enrichment facilities are going to be built. And Iran has agreed to stop enriching uranium to over 5%. Now, so the deal here has been made. It may only be an interim deal for the moment, which means that negotiations have to start up again in 6 months' time. But at the moment, it feels like a historic breakthrough, especially after a night spent in the media center.
Absolutely, Polly. Thank you so much for staying up for us and bringing us the very, very latest coming out of Geneva and the details of this groundbreaking deal achieved today between Iran and the six world powers. Polly Boyko there reporting. Well, Iran's right to enrich uranium was thought to be the main stumbling block in striking the deal in Geneva. And here's what American and Iranian foreign ministers had to say about it after the negotiations.
We believe that the current agreement, the current plan of action, as we call it, in two distinct places, has a very clear reference to the fact that Iranian enrichment program will continue and will be a part of any agreement, now and in the future.
This first step, let me be clear, this first step does not say that Iran has a right to enrichment. No matter what interpretive comments are made, it is not in this document. There is no right to enrich within the four corners of the NPT, and this document does not do that.
Well, we can now further discuss the long-awaited deal with Iran with Norman Salman, who is director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, and he joins us live now from San Francisco. Norman, thank you for joining us here, RT, to discuss this. So, first off, we've just heard top diplomats from Iran and then the U.S. interpreting the deal quite differently. Who's right here regarding the uranium enrichment?
Well, I think they're both covering their bases in terms of their domestic audience, and I think it's splitting hairs that don't matter very much. The fact is the U.S. government has promoted for many decades, including ironically during the Shah's time in Iran, the development of nuclear power across the world, including Iran back in the 1960s. So the U.S. is promoting nuclear power. And it's important to people in Iran, as I learned when I spoke with folks on the street in Tehran a number of years ago, to assert the prerogative to develop nuclear power energy. So I think that's a rather minor point. What is so key is that this is a breakthrough for diplomacy, that aside from apparently the governments of Saudi Arabia and Israel, throughout the region and beyond, we can expect a lot of positive response to this agreement, which I think is a historic breakthrough and a very good one.
Well, you just said, Mr. Salman, you just said that this is, of course, a victory of diplomacy and a groundbreaking deal. But, you know, I just want to perhaps discuss these contradictions or perhaps differences stipulated in the agreement, because, you know, some may think that, of course, this is a temporary fix for 6 months. But what happens after that, given that it's taken a decade to get here? Do you have faith at this point that the sides will find a long-term solution, given the differences that exist at the moment, of course?
Well, I think it's a plausible pathway that's been laid out now. And it's so important that the momentum has been reversed. The pressures towards war, stoked by some elements in the U.S. Congress, certainly pushed by Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, as well as the Saudi government, that momentum has been effectively not only hit the brakes, but actually has gone now in the last hours in the other direction. And that is a crucial dynamic, because when you have all the major players of those negotiations wanting the deal and getting the deal, it's a very favorable foreshadowing of what we're going to see 6 months and beyond. That said, it's going to be crucial that all the governments involved in this agreement stand by it and push back against pressure from Saudi Arabia and Israel, as well as the hawks in the U.S. Congress.
Well, speaking of the hawks in the U.S. Congress, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'd like to discuss now the domestic situation in America regarding this deal, because you know, in the situation right now, it seems like the administration has found itself, as they say, between the rock and a hard place. So how will this go down at home?
Well, the administration for a while found itself between Iran and a hard place, you might say. But because of the power of the presidency and the fact that a deal is in hand now, I think that the right-wing elements in the U.S. Congress, those who followed the lead of Benjamin Netanyahu, these were some Republicans and some Democrats, tonight and in the next days, they will be back on their heels. They will have to regroup. The momentum is now with this agreement, but there is no question that the Israeli government and those in the U.S. Congress who want an attack on Iran, they will not rest. They will hate this agreement. They will try to undermine it.
Now, what about the situation in the region, in the Middle East specifically? And, you know, speaking of Israel, as we know, Benjamin Netanyahu has been stepping up anti-deal rhetoric here. So what will be happening in, you know, in his country and around it, of course? Will you think the tensions be eased, or on the contrary increase as a result of this groundbreaking deal today in Geneva?
Well, I think the tensions are going to be exacerbated within the two countries of Israel and Saudi Arabia, because they are going to be so unhappy with this deal. But I think in the region as a whole, this is a very positive development, because we want to defuse the tensions. We want to reduce the chances of cross-border attacks and international launching of major warfare. So I think that there's a new potential here to de-escalate a lot of the tensions, and I hope that long-term we can have a ban on all weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and otherwise, in the entire region. This could be a good step in that direction.
All right, Norman Solomon, thank you so much for your views here, Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy.
Thank you.
Well, now let's take a look at the long and winding road to the historic deal. Iran's nuclear program started in the 1950s with the help of the U.S., but it is in the late 20th century that tensions started really heating up around its atomic ambitions. Back in 1996, the U.S. firmly moved down the track of sanctions, lambasting Tehran after alleging its nuclear program was for military purposes. And that's also when talks started, but they reached deadlock in 2005. And Iran's president at the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, resumed uranium enrichment. The UN were quick to respond unanimously, agreeing on their own set of sanctions a year later. Now, this, though, failed to convince Iran to drop its nuclear program. On the contrary, in 2010, it increased the level of uranium enrichment to 20%. And that was widely seen as a significant step towards towards arms production. Well, the move allegedly triggered the assassinations of 4 Iranian nuclear scientists with Israel's Mossad suspected of involvement. And finally, in June this year, Iran elected Hassan Rouhani as its new president, something many see as a game changer in Iran's relations with the West. Well, what seemed like a major obstacle to a long-awaited deal was Israel's staunch opposition to any compromise. During a previous round of talks 2 weeks ago, that position seemed to be impacting on the negotiating stances of France and the U.S. Well, for more on this, we can now talk to our correspondent, Paula Slier, who is in Tel Aviv, and she's gauging the reaction of Israel to this groundbreaking deal there. Hello to you, Paula. So do tell us about Israel's reaction. And, of course, some are saying that Israel is not going to be happy about it.
Well, so far there's been reaction only from one Israeli minister, the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Yuval Steinitz. He said, and I'm quoting, that the agreement remains a bad one that will make reaching a permanent solution harder. He also went on to say that this deal is based on Iranian deception and self-delusion. Now, what is interesting is that there has been a difference in terms of how the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and top members of his government have been reacting during this last round of talks in Geneva. Whereas in the past, Netanyahu was very public in his criticism of the deal, the Israelis recently have turned their attention to some kind of quiet diplomacy behind the scenes. What we do know is that Steinitz has been on the phone with all the heads of the negotiating teams in Geneva. At the same time, he's also spoken with 2 of the foreign ministers who were involved. What the Israelis are trying to do, or what they at least were trying to do, was to influence the wording of the statement. What we're being told now is that high-ranking diplomats from some of the countries that were involved in these talks will soon be making their way to Tel Aviv to brief the Israelis in terms of what happened in Geneva and on the way forward. Among the points that the Israelis were particularly concerned about and were hoping to influence in this last round were, for example, the whole issue of the Arak reactor. Here, the Israelis were demanding that the agreement says that all activity at the Arak plant be halted. They were also concerned over the wording of scientific research. The Israelis saying that they want this deal not to give legitimacy to the Iranians to be able to continue developing other aspects of their nuclear program under the wording of scientific research. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has said that this deal makes Israel safer. No doubt there'll be a lot of scoffing in Tel Aviv at these comments, because it is precisely this that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing, and that is that the deal not only does not make Israel not safer, but it is a threat to the international community. We're waiting for some kind of reaction and some kind of comment from him later in the day today. One of the big big questions, of course, is what does Israel do next? It has been threatening for quite some time that it will conduct a military strike. Particularly the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has used a lot of warmongering. There were also reports that the Israelis were working behind the scenes with the Saudis of the possibility of launching some kind of military action if indeed a deal is signed off in Geneva, as has been now.
All right, Paula, thanks for gauging the reaction in Israel for us there. Our correspondent, Paula, reporting from Tel Aviv. Well, prior to this round of talks, there were reports that if a deal was struck in Geneva, Israel may join forces with Saudi Arabia in a military campaign against Iran. The once unthinkable alliance of former foes is allegedly prompted by both nations' refusal to accept any compromise on Tehran's nuclear program. Jamal Abdi, policy director at the National Iranian American Council, however, believes such a conflict is a very unlikely scenario.
Every time Netanyahu wants another sanctions bill passed in Congress, he makes sure to send signals to lawmakers here in the U.S. that, hey, you have to pass this bill, otherwise you're going to have a war on your hands that Israel is going to start and the United States is going to finish. The Saudis have done the same thing, not as publicly. I think that anytime you hear the Israelis and now the Saudis talking loud about military action, that's a signal that military action is not necessarily being planned, but that they're trying to use this as leverage in order to drive the hand of the U.S. or the international community in a certain direction. When they start being quiet about a potential military strike, that's when you have to think, okay, maybe something is actually underway here.